no one's ever asked us to turn off a podcast when we just kind of turn it on while everyone's kind of doing their own thing. And usually when the podcast is done, they'll say, "Why'd you turn it off?" I'm like, "I didn't. It's just going to the next one." Or like a conversation will start about whatever that podcast episode was about.
Welcome to the Healthy Screen Habits Podcast. I'm Hillary Wilkinson. Whether you're starting your parenting journey with a newborn or looking to connect with your teen on technology, let's learn some new healthy screen habits together. I've got a fun fact. This thing that you're listening to, this type of media, was originally called audio blogging. People wrote, read, and shared their content over the internet like audio blog posts. And then in 2004, a writer for The Guardian, his name was Ben Hammersley, combined the words iPod and broadcast to create the portmanteau podcast. And since then, podcasting has boomed. There seems to be a great discrepancy kind of in the true number of podcasts currently available, but the numbers range, I got it real tight here, between 3 and 5 million. So clearly my top-notch research is on point. But I'm telling you all of this because I understand how hard it is to find something good to listen to. And my guest today has taken the frustration of trying to find something that you'd like to listen to and created a great resource that we are going to learn so much about. It's called the Friendly Podcast Guide. It's going to save you so much time and frustration. Welcome to Healthy Screen Habits, Andi Smiley.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here and talk podcast with you.
Yeah. Podcaster to podcaster or audio
Yes.
blogger to audio blogger. That
Yes,
kind of cracked me
truly.
up.
I feel like I've heard that before, but I did not remember until you told me audio blogger. That is a rough. I'm really glad we switched because that does
Right,
not have the same
right.
ring to it.
Exactly. And it gave me an excuse to use my fancy pants word,
Yes.
portmanteau.
Yes, it's a
Which,
beautiful word. I mean, we've
thank
got to
you.
slide it in
Thank you.
wherever we can.
Exactly. It served me well in the SATs and now again, 30 years later or however many. Okay. So, Andi, let's talk about the Friendly Podcast Guide. I want just like, let's go right into it. Can you talk about like the format and what gave you the idea to create it?
Yes. Okay. So, like you were saying, I want it to be a time saver. If you want to listen to podcasts or find a new podcast, I don't want it to be an arduous process. I want it to be easy. So, all of my episodes are around 15 minutes or less. And it just helps you kind of get a feel for the vibe of the show so that you can either decide to go and listen to it or decide that that one's not for you. And I want that to be like a quick, easy thing so that you still have time to go and listen to that podcast that you just found out you wanted to listen to instead of listening to me for 30, 45 minutes to an hour and then not have time to go and listen to whatever new podcast you just found out about. So that's the format of the show. And the reason I started it is because I love podcasts. Podcasts have like made my life so much better as a mom. And so I wanted to share all of this goodness with other moms. Like I use podcasts like to like when I'm doing dishes, I'll listen to an entertaining podcast to make it less awful. Or if I'm trying to learn about something, I can listen to a podcast about healthy screen habits or something in history that I find interesting while I'm also doing something else. And yeah, podcasts are just awesome. And I want more moms to understand how many podcasts are out there and just like know all of the resources that are there, but in a way that doesn't take over their life.
It kind of reminds me of like the little mini TV guides that we used to get
Oh, yeah.
when like way back in the day, Gen X talks here. But you'd get your TV guide and then you'd get like just a little synopsis of like what each show was going to be about. And so
Mhm.
then you could schedule your weekly viewing. So now we can schedule our listening thanks to you.
Yes.
Okay,
Luckily, it's a little bit more flexible though. Like you can just listen to me whenever. You don't have to like
for
tune
sure.
in at 10 a.m. or whatever.
Right, right. And so I'm going to kind of like switch lanes here because we're talking about podcasts, but like you said, this is a healthy screen habits platform, but I really do think the tech kind of holds hands here. And can you explain in your words what makes podcasts such a great alternative to screens or having your children on, that word screen time?
Totally. So let me back up just a smidge and say that the other like part of the friendly podcast guide is I also introduce parents to kid podcasts. So I do have loads and loads of podcasts that are for moms, but I also have a lot of kid podcasts that I talk about on my show because kid podcasts have made my motherhood experience so much better because I can entertain my kids without a screen, if that's in the car, if that's when I just need a quick break. And I feel like not very many parents know about kid podcasts yet. So I want to spread the word and help more people know about kid podcasts. So back to your question about screen time and like how podcasts can be an alternative to screens. At least for kids, I have noticed from like my own experience and other people's experiences that I've talked to that have kids that listen to kid podcasts is that their imagination muscle just gets worked so much better when they're listening to a kid podcast than when they're watching a show or playing a video game. And I know that there's research out there and I do not remember numbers, but I know that listening to stories for kids is so good for their little brains. And kid podcasts are a great way to introduce them to that almost. Audiobooks are awesome. Love a good audiobook, but they are long. And we've got kid podcasts. I have kid podcasts that my kiddos listen to that are 5 minutes long. So, like, there's something out there for every kid. And also, at least like as an anecdotal evidence, my kids are less like zombie-like, if we want to say that, after they listen to a kid podcast than when they have their screen time during the day. And I feel like it's usually easier for us to pivot or like for us to like move on to the next thing when it's a kid podcast compared to watching a show or playing a video game.
Right, right. And I can tell you from the brain science perspective, it doesn't hit that dopamine reward circuit as hard
Mm.
that the screen time would. And so that's when you're talking about that. They don't seem to be so zombified.
Yes.
and and now I could be wrong about this because I don't have littles anymore, but I would expect that transitioning to a next activity off of a podcast might not be as volcanic as getting off of one screen and then going to a next thing.
Yes. My kids do love kid podcasts a lot. So sometimes they're frustrated at me when I turn off a kid
Sure.
podcast, but I feel like it's usually a little bit easier for them to almost like listen to my reasoning if that's a good way to say it, like to be like actually now we're going to the park, like it's not like I'm gonna go torture you, like we're gonna go do something else fun. Like so I think they're just able to like use that front part of their brain a little bit faster than when they're watching TV.
Yeah, I love it. When we come back, I'm going to be asking Andi Smiley for tips and tools surrounding kid based podcasts. Extra thanks goes out this episode to Danielle Waters for her unwavering support of the podcast and the Healthy Screen Habits organization. If you'd like to make a difference and contribute to the education and empowerment of families building their healthy screen habits, please go to healthyscreenhabits.org. Find the Take Action tab and scroll down to click the donate button. 100% of your donation will be used to spread awareness and bring families the tools they need to develop healthy screen habits. I'm speaking with Andi Smiley, the founder of the Friendly Podcast Guide. She's a mom of three littles who are ages 6 and under, and podcasts have saved her sanity. Now she wants to help other moms find podcasts without getting overwhelmed. So she started her own podcast about podcasts. As the host of the Friendly Podcast Guide, Andy helps moms find podcasts for themselves and for their kids. So before we start diving into like actual titles, Andy, I have a nuts and bolts question. And it seems like with littles, oftentimes when a phone is present, it kind of becomes this thing of greatest interest. Like that's what they want,
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that your intent is strictly audio here with listening, what devices do you recommend using to listen to podcasts with kids?
Okay, so I actually kind of have a long list, but we're gonna try and narrow it down a little bit. So, because my kiddos are 6 and under, a lot of the time, especially when we're in the car or all together in the kitchen, like doing stuff like that, I'll do it on my phone and then like put it to a Bluetooth speaker so that like the phone, like you were saying, the phone isn't really the thing that's playing it, and so they're not wanting to like play on my phone. They'll just listen to it or I know we don't have an Alexa in our house, but Alexa is another really great way to play kid podcasts because kid podcasts are on all major podcast players. A lot of parents don't know that. Like there are specific kid podcast apps, but that's not the only place you can find kid podcasts. They're on like Spotify, Apple, and Overcast, all of the podcast apps. You just have to go looking for them. I will say when my kids get a little bit older, I think I will get them have them have their own kid podcast app, or we'll probably have an app on a device, and then each kid can have their own like profile on these kids apps, kid podcast apps. Some of my favorites are Storytopia and Kids Pod. Those are kind of like my two favorites right now. And both of them have the opportunity to have multiple profiles so that, I have three littles. So each kid can have their own profile and they can just like flood that profile with all of their favorite kid podcasts. Then it's not going to be taking up as much space on my phone, which will be nice. um, um, so that's like podcast apps. You can access a lot of podcasts via like their like audio players, like a Yodo player. We don't have a Yodo player. We have a Story Button, which is literally just a kid podcast player. That
So
one,
what
my
is it?
kids.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no,
So
go.
so what does that look like? It's not it because I feel like I've seen it on your website. It's not like on your phone. It's
No, it truly looks like an old-fashioned radio. Like it's like a box and it has like a speaker on the front, and technically there's a screen so that you can like toggle through all of the kid podcast options, but it's not very exciting. It's just literally what you see on your podcast player like on your phone. So it's just like play and pause and like where you are in the episode. Um and that one I love because like I said, we don't have Alexa or anything like that, especially not in the kids rooms. And so the Story Button mostly stays in my kiddos room, and they listen to it as they're winding down for bed. So like we read books and then they're usually not ready for bed because they just have so much more energy than I do. And so they can sit and listen to some kid podcasts to kind of wind down, play Legos or whatever while they're listening. And then when it's like time for them to actually get in their beds, we'll turn on a sleep podcast. I'll sing to them, and then they'll like go off to sleep while listening to a sleep podcast. So kid podcasts, like I said, are kind of like in every aspect of my life. But that so to answer your question, there are kid podcast players like a Story Button or a Yodo player. There's also kid podcast apps. And then if that feels overwhelming, don't do any of that yet. Just pull up your own podcast player that you're listening to this podcast on and search for some kid podcasts, and they will be there for you.
okay. Okay, awesome. So also I have kind of a challenge in my house. And I am a lover of all things verbal. I love stories. I'm a huge NPR listener. I love like This American Life. Subscribe to the Trader Joe's podcast. Like
Yes.
we'll base my grocery shopping off of that. Um, but all of that aside, my people, meaning my teenagers, do not love a podcast, and I get it. They're in a very different stage of life than I am, where they have to sit for hours in a day listening to
Hmm.
others lecture, and they're really into exploring like different musical genres and stuff like that. But that being said, I feel like I could have done a much better job introducing podcasts to them. And I think it wouldn't have elicited such a knee-jerk reaction that they have now, you know? And so I'm just kind of wondering, in describing your day, I feel like you've kind of covered a lot of that. But do you have like steps to a successful introduction to podcast listening with kids? Do you recommend, like, would it be in the, like you said, in the car? How did you do it so that you have good little listeners, not somebody that's like, not more voices?
Well, truly, I'll tell you my experience and then I'll tell you some other advice I got from other people. So for me, my kids, when I started my podcast, my oldest was 4. So they were just excited to do whatever mom was doing. I feel like I caught them like at a really good age and they were like, "You have podcasts, mom. Why don't I get podcasts?" And I was like, I didn't even know kid podcasts existed at the time. When I started my show, I didn't even, well, I had just found them when I started my show. And so I was like, "Oh, look, here are some podcasts for you." So I think I kind of lucked out. Like I hit that sweet spot. But I will say, I recently did a interview on my own show with Rachel Lacey, who is one of the co-founders of Kids Pod, one of those kid podcast apps. And she said, when you're trying to introduce like podcasts to your kids, don't make it a big event. Like she said, don't say, turn off the TV, we're going to listen to a podcast together. Like, don't make it a thing. Instead, when everyone's already doing something in the same general area, if that's driving in the car or if that's eating a snack, just turn it on. Don't say anything, just turn it on. And we both commented in that interview that no one's ever asked us to turn off a podcast when we just kind of turn it on while everyone's kind of doing their own thing. And usually, like when the podcast is done, they'll either say, like they'll my kids at least will be like, "Why'd you turn it off?" I'm like, "I didn't. It's just going to the next one." Or like a conversation will start about whatever that podcast episode was about. Like one of Rachel Lacey, the gal I interviewed, one of her family's favorite shows is Wow in the World, which is like a science podcast, and it brings up really interesting sciencey things. And so she said that a lot of times after they listen to an episode, they'll talk a little bit more about it and be like, "Can you believe that?" Or "How does that even work? Let's look that up." Or, whatever. So like it brings that like family time. It continues it
Discussion.
and
Mhm.
makes it just like more memorable, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So you've given us some good titles already. Do you have like, it's probably really difficult to ask, like, to narrow it down, but do you have like a top 5 list of kid-friendly, do you call them kid podcasts or kid-friendly podcasts? What do you call them?
Truly, for ease, I just call them kid podcasts, but
Okay.
I don't know if there's technically a name. Like
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's just like the shortest, I think, to call
Yeah.
them kid podcasts, because so that's what I call them. But some people call them family friendly podcasts. Some people call them kid friendly. I think it's just
Mhm.
podcasts for kids.
Mhm.
So whatever you want to call it, I think we all get it. As far as recommendations, you're right, it is very hard. So pretty much I just kind of thought of some of the podcasts that my kids love right now, and then some for like, because my kids are little, I also thought of some that are like for older kids because you know, a 14-year-old doesn't want to listen to the same thing that a 6-year-old
Right.
does. So some of my kiddos' favorites right now are Bobby Wonder, which is about a boy with blue hair who turns 10, finds out he's an alien and has superpowers, and he has to save his or keep his town safe from the evil villain who is also a 10-year-old. Adorable. Each episode's like if I'm 10 to 15 minutes, and good sound effects. Each character has their own voice, so it's really engaging, like an audio drama. Love it. Another one of our family's favorites is kids animal stories. So my kiddos love animals. They love learning about animals. We have so many animal books in our house right now. And so when we found kids animal stories, it was a like home run. The each episode is about a different animal, and it's a story that like has that animal as the main character. So it's not just like listing a bunch of animal facts. You learn animal facts while you listen to this story about this animal. So cute. Each episode's about 10 minutes, and truly, I do have to add, those sometimes they have mystery episodes when like you have to guess what the animal is. And like Mr. Jim is the host. He tells the story without telling you what kind of animal, and you're supposed to try and guess by the end. Super cute. My kids love it. They yell at Mr. Jim, I think it's a monkey. So yeah, very, very fun at our house. Um, one of my so I have two little girls and a little boy, and the two little girls are obsessed with Frozen right now. So I found a Frozen podcast, which has been another home run. It's called Disney Frozen Forces of Nature, and this one is it takes place after Frozen 2, the movie. And it's just another adventure that they go on. And it has all of the characters, Elsa, Anna, Olaf, Kristoff, all of them and all of their voices. It's a lovely one. So those are kind of like for younger kids. And then I
Uh-huh.
have two for older kids. The first one's called 6 Minutes. This one's like an audio drama. This one's fun because honestly, did you ever watch 24, that TV show?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it kind of has that similar vibe. Each episode is roughly 6 minutes long, and it just takes you through this like super intense story about this family who finds a girl and they don't know where she came from and she's lost her memory, but she has a cool hoverboard. Like, really interesting. This one I honestly would say would be a good one for road trips or for like every day after school, we're gonna turn on 6 minutes and listen to a snack and listen to a snack, eat a snack while we listen, and like just something to like look forward to as a family.
Mm-hmm.
That one would be a fun one because it's more of an audio drama. It like builds on itself, so you were on the start on episode one, that type of thing. And then the last one, truly, I already mentioned it, but Wow in the World is a really fun science podcast because it's super well produced. It's got a lot of different sound effects in there, and like they talk about things that are like I don't understand some of them. I'm like, okay, I need to listen to this one because I don't know what you're talking about. So that one's a fun one if your kids are like wanting to learn or like just want to understand how the world works a little bit better. Wow in the World's a fun one.
So just have one more quick question before we go to break, and that is that I feel like you touched on it a little bit before, but I wanted to go back to, some of the stories or some podcasts. I'm a huge fan of like true crime. Like I listen to a lot of true crime while I'm, cleaning the bathroom or doing something like that. But that type of listening is absolutely not appropriate content for all age levels. So, do you have techniques about how parents can manage like setting boundaries or, on podcast listening?
So I kind of do. Um, the main thing that I will say is like those kid podcast apps. I know at least with Kids Pod and Storytopia that they've been vetted by a adult, like a mom who has listened to it and said, "Okay, this is okay for kids. This doesn't have any content on there." And truly, I would say that would probably work for teens as well. I know that on each of those apps there are podcasts for older kids, um, but not really like there isn't really any like I can't even think of the word like filters for
Right.
like normal podcast apps.
Hmm.
I think this would just have to be one of those things where you're like checking in with your kids or being like, "Hey, what podcast are you listening to?"
Right.
Um, and this sounds a little silly or maybe not silly but like self-promoting, but one of the things that I talk about in each of my episodes is this podcast okay for little ears? Like that's one of the questions that I ask because it is for moms. And
Hmm.
so you could take that as like if you're listening to an episode and you know that your teenager's interested in this podcast that I'm talking about, and the host is like, well, we drop a lot of F-bombs and my interviewees have full reign to say whatever they want about their sex life, then you're like, my 14-year-old shouldn't be listening to that episode. So I think that's why I put that in there, was to because there isn't really a filter at this point for podcast apps. Um so that's kind of like not my favorite answer to give, but that's kind of
No, but
where
it's
that is.
realistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, we have to take a short break, but when we come back, I am going to ask Andi Smiley for her healthy screen habit. Gab Wireless now offers options: wearable tech like the Gab Watch, devices like Gab phones, and even a kid safe, non explicit music library. Built on the most reliable wireless network in the country, Gab is a go to for first phones and safe tech. Get safety, peace of mind, and an added discount by using the code HSHabits at checkout. I'm speaking with Andi Smiley, the creator of the podcast and website that goes by the same name, Friendly Podcast Guide. And I want to urge everyone to check out the website at friendlypodcastguide.com. Of course, this, as well as any of the shows that she had talked about, is all going to be linked in our show notes. And Andi, on every episode of the Healthy Screen Habits podcast, I ask each guest for a healthy screen habit. This is going to be a tip or takeaway that our listeners can put into practice in their own home.
I have one that I use regularly. So during the witching hour at my house, that's around 4 o'clock when I'm trying to make dinner. Instead of letting it get the best of you, try grabbing some coloring pages, Play-Doh, Magnetiles, whatever to keep kids' hands busy, and then turn on a kid podcast, and you'll get at least 30 minutes to make dinner or just take a breath. And your kids will be working their imagination muscle while also being entertained. And if the kid podcast recommendations I've given today aren't floating your boat, or you don't think your kids are going to like them, I have a whole kid podcast guide with 28 different shows for you to choose from. And I'm pretty positive that there will be at least one on there that your kids will like.
As always, you can find a complete transcript of this show and a link to any of the resources discussed by visiting the show notes for this episode. You do this by going to healthyscreenhabits.org, click the podcast button, and find this episode. Thank you so much, Andi, for being here today. I can't wait to go listen to your latest episode so I can find out other fun things to listen to.
Well, thank you so much for letting me be on the show today. It's been a pleasure.
For more information, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Healthy Screen Habits. Make sure to visit our website, healthyscreenhabits.org, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode. It's free, it's fun, and you get a healthy new screen habit each week. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate you giving us a quick rating. It really does help other people find us and spread the word of healthy screen habits. Or if you'd simply like to tell a friend, we'd love that too. I so appreciate you spending your time with me this week, and I look forward to learning more healthy habits together.